The rain had stopped an hour before she reached the edge of the pine flat, but the cold had not, and it settled into Marisol Vega's shoulders the way a debt settles into a house, quietly, without asking. She had walked 11 miles since the coach dropped her at the crossroads with a shrug and a fare she could not fully pay, and the last of those miles she had walked in the dark, guided by nothing but the smell of wood smoke on the wind. She carried a single canvas bag over one shoulder, and wrapped in oilcloth against her chest a battered brass tuning fork that had belonged to her father, a man who had built and repaired the great pipe organs of 3 cathedrals before the fever took him, and took with him every account that had kept her fed. The tuning fork was all she had left of a life in which she had been someone. It hummed against her ribs when she walked, or she imagined it did, and that small imagined hum was the only warmth she had brought with her, out of the ruin of everything. It burned in a stone ring outside a low timber lodge at the far end of the flat, and beside it a figure sat unmoving, broad through the shoulders, hat tipped forward, a long instrument of some kind laid across his knees. Marisol stopped at the tree line the way a wild thing stops, weighing whether the light was worth the risk of the thing that made it. Hunger decided for her. She had not eaten since the morning of the day before. She stepped out of the dark, and gravel spoke under her boots, and the man's head lifted, slow and unsurprised, as though he had been expecting her his whole life, and was only now getting around to seeing her face, a woman. That was the first thing he registered, and the second was that she was near the end of what she had. Elias Thorne was a slow man. He would tell anyone that, and did, when the subject came up, which was rarely, because there was no one out here to raise it. He was slow to speak and slower to trust, and slowest of all to change his mind once it was made. He ran a stringed instrument, works out here in the pine flat, a barn full of drying spruce and maple and rosewood aging into the tone that only patience could coax from it. And he made violins and cellos, and the tall, solemn double basses that traveled by wagon to the concert halls of the coast. His wife had been gone 4 years. His trade had gone soft in 3 of them. And in the last of them a man from the coast had come with papers and a soft handshake, and the slow rot in Elias Thorne's affairs had begun to smell like the end of things. He did not know that yet, not fully. He only knew he was tired, and that a woman had walked out of the dark into his firelight, and that she looked at his fire the way a person looks at bread. She did not ask for the bread. That was the first thing he noticed about her after the hunger. She whispered because her throat was raw with cold. "May I sit by your fire?" And Elias Thorne looked at her a long moment, and then he looked at the flames, and he heard himself say a thing he had not planned to say, a thing that came up out of some buried younger part of him. "Funny," he said. "It burns better with company." He had not meant it as an invitation to anything but the log ring. But she heard it, and something in her straightened, and she came and sat across the fire from him and held out her thin hands to it, and neither of them said anything for the better part of an hour. That was the beginning, though neither of them would have named it so. It was only 2 tired people and a fire that, it turned out, did burn better with the 2 of them tending it. He fed her from a pot of beans and salt pork kept warm at the coals, and he watched her eat with the discipline of someone who had been hungry before and did not intend to shame herself over it. When she was done, she wiped the bowl clean with her thumb and set it neatly by the stones and told him, in a voice that had steadied, exactly who she was. Marisol Vega, 29 years old, widow of a man whose debts had swallowed her savings, daughter of an organ builder, trained since childhood in the tuning of instruments and the reckoning of accounts, because her father had taught her that a man who could not hear a false fifth and could not read a ledger. She said all this plainly, offering it as a person offers references, not pity. She was not asking for charity. She was asking whether there was work. Elias Thorne turned the long instrument on his knees, an unfinished cello neck, over once in his big hands. He said the trade was thin. He said he could not pay much. He said the last woman who had tried to keep the lodge and the books had lasted a winter and gone. He laid it out flat, the way he laid out everything. No softening and no false hope. $3 a week and her keep. And the cold truth that the work was hard and the place was falling to pieces. And Marisol Vega, who had walked 11 miles on nothing, looked at him across the fire and said she would take it and that she would take it on, the understanding that she ate at the table and not standing at the stove because she was help and not a stray. Elias considered this. Then he nodded once, the way he did everything once, and it was settled. The lodge, when she saw it by daylight, told her the whole story before Elias said a word of it. The main room was a good room gone to neglect, ash cold in the grate, a child's small boots by the door, a film of dust over a mantel that had once held someone's careful arrangements. Sammy Thorne, 7 years old, silent as a stone, who watched her from doorways with his father's steady gray eyes and did not speak, had not spoken much at all since his mother died. He mirrored the man in everything, in the tilt of the head and the slow blink and the way he weighed a stranger before deciding. Marisol did not fuss over him. She had learned, long ago, that some hurts close up when you press them and open only when you leave them be. She simply began to work, and she let the boy watch, and she let the watching be the whole of their acquaintance for a while. She worked the way water works on stone, without hurry and without stopping. She scrubbed the cold grease from the stove and got a real fire going in it, and had bread rising by the third morning, real bread. The smell of it filling the low rooms and drawing the boy to the kitchen door, where he stood with his thumb in his mouth, watching the loaves come out golden. She swept and aired and mended, and in the evenings, when the boy was abed and Elias sat at his bench in the barn, shaping wood by lamplight, she asked quietly. He waved a hand at a drawer without looking up. He was a slow man to give trust, but he was no man to hoard a thing that was already lost. What she found in that drawer took her 3 nights to understand and turned her cold once she did. The accounts were not merely neglected, they were a slow strangling, dressed up in the language of help. 2 years back, needing money to age a large lot of tonewood, Elias Thorne had borrowed $600 from a man named Cornelius Witt, a broker of fine goods from the coast. The terms as Elias understood them were generous. The terms as written were not. Marisol traced the columns by candlelight and found the interest compounding in a way Elias had plainly never read, found the mispayment penalties stacked like bricks, found that the $600 had become, by the letter of the paper, $1,140, and found the clause buried on the third page in a hand designed to be skimmed, that gave Witt the right to seize the entire works, land and barn, and every board of aging wood, if the sum was not paid in full by the 1st of April. She checked the calendar tacked by the door. 51 days she did not tell Elias that night. She sat with the number a while, the way she used to sit with a note that was subtly out of true hearing, all the ways it was wrong before deciding how to bring it right. 51 days and $1,140, against $3 a week and a barn full of instruments no one was coming to buy, because Elias Thorne was too far out and too slow to travel and too proud to beg for orders. It was a war, and it was being lost, and the man losing it did not fully know he was in it. She thought of her father, who had said that a man who could not read a ledger would be cheated. She thought of the tuning fork against her ribs. And she thought, sitting there in the guttering light, that she had not walked 11 miles through the cold to watch another house go down into ruin without lifting a hand. She would lift both. The next morning she began, and she began without announcement, because she had learned that the loud helper is often the one who does the least. She asked Elias, over the breakfast table where she now sat, as agreed, what instruments were finished and playable in the barn. He named them, puzzled. 4 violins, a viola, 2 cellos, and 1 double bass, all done and strung and simply sitting, aging past their prime, for want of a buyer. She asked what they were worth. He named a figure. Lo, the figure of a man who had stopped believing in his own work. She wrote it down. Then she asked for the names of every music master, every conservatory, every church choir director, and every wealthy amateur her father might have known on the coast, and she found that between his memory and her own, they could raise a list of 31 names. That night she began to write letters. She wrote 31 letters in a week, in the clean, confident hand her father had drilled into her, and in each one she did not beg. She described the aging of the spruce and the flame of the maple and the particular warm carrying tone that only a maker working slowly in silence, far from the noise of the city, could bring out of the wood. She wrote as a person who knew instruments, to people who loved them, and she made Elias Thorne's slowness, which he thought a weakness, sound like the very thing worth paying for. She priced the instruments, not at his defeated figure, but at their true worth, and she enclosed with each letter a single line drawn by the boy Sammy, who had begun, shyly, to draw the shapes of violins in the margins of her paper. And something about those small, honest drawings from a maker's son moved the people who received them more than any argument could. Elias watched all this from the edge of his own life, the way a man watches weather he does not control. He had never seen anyone move through his affairs like she did, quiet and certain and quick. He told himself she was help and nothing more. $3 a week, and he told himself so several times a day, which was itself a kind of admission. In the evenings now, she brought her ledger and her letters out to the barn and worked at the end of his bench while he shaped wood. And the two of them passed hours, saying almost nothing, the lamp between them, the plane whispering over spruce, her pen scratching. And it was, he found, the least lonely he had been in 4 years. One night he looked up and found the boy asleep against her side, and her hand resting easy on the small back, and he had to look away and be busy with his work a while, because the sight of it went into him deeper than he was prepared for. He was a slow man, but he was not a blind one, and he was beginning, at last, to see the first replies to the letters came at the end of February, and they came with money. A conservatory on the coast wanted the double bass and 2 of the violins, and enclosed a bank draft for $400 against delivery. A church director bought the viola outright for 90 prek. A wealthy amateur, moved by a child's drawing, took a cello for 200 and asked whether Mr. Thorne would make him another to match. Marisol laid the drafts on the breakfast table one morning without ceremony, the way she did everything, and told Elias the total. $790 in hand, and firm interest and more, against a debt of $1,140. She said it evenly. She said they were not there yet, but they could see the far bank now, and that was a thing that had not been true a month before. Elias Thorne looked at the money and then at her for a long time. He had not known, until she showed him laid out plain, exactly how bad, or exactly how a soft-spoken man from the coast had built a trap around him, one clause at a time, while shaking his hand. And he saw now that this woman who had walked out of the dark asking only to sit by his fire had in 6 weeks done what he could not have done in 6 years, because he heard tone in wood and she heard something false in numbers, and each of them had an ear the other lacked. He said slow that he did not know how to thank her, and she said dry that he could start by not letting the next man from the coast get past the first page. He almost smiled at that. It was the closest either of them had come. Then, on the 20th of March, with 11 days to the deadline, and the debt closed to within $200 by a 4th sale, Cornelius Witt came up the road in a hired buggy. He was exactly as Marisol had pictured him from his handwriting, soft-handed and smooth-faced, wearing coast tailoring that had never seen a day's labor. And he came smiling, the smile of a man. He did not expect a woman to open the door of Elias Thorne's lodge. He looked past her, into the room, asking for Thorne, and when Elias came, he spoke only to Elias, laying his papers on the table with the ease of a man laying down winning cards, saying it was a shame, a real shame, but the 1st of April was near, and a sum plainly could not be met, and he was prepared to take the works off Thorne's hands and spare him the humiliation of default. Marisol stood by the stove with her hands folded and let him talk. When he had finished, she said quietly, "Might I see those papers, Mr. Witt?" He looked at her as though a chair had spoken. He said with a soft little laugh that it was hardly a matter for her sweetheart, that it was men's business and complicated. She crossed the room without hurry and picked the papers up anyway, and she read them in front of him, turning to the 3rd page, to the clause, and she began, in the calm voice of a person reading music aloud, to tell him precisely what his own contract said. She named the original sum, 600. She named the stated rate. She named the compounding he had written to run one way in the body of the agreement, and another, quietly, in the schedule at the back, a discrepancy that, under the plainest reading of contract law, rendered the inflated total unenforceable and reduced his claim to the honest sum, $600 plus fair simple interest. Witt stopped smiling. He said that was not how it read. She said it was exactly how it read, and offered to walk him through it clause by clause in front of any judge on the coast he cared to name, and added that she had already written to 2 men who held similar paper from him, and would be glad to compare notes. She laid on the table then, next to his papers, her own ledger, the sales, the drafts, the correspondence, $890, accounted for down to the coin, gathered in 7 weeks by a widow and a boy's drawings, and she said she was prepared to settle his honest claim in full that very morning. She did not raise her voice once. She did not need to. The facts stood on the table between them, and facts, unlike men, cannot be talked down. Cornelius Witt looked at the ledger and the drafts, and the woman who had built the wall in front of him, board by board, while he was busy underestimating her, and he understood that he had lost, and that he had lost to the person in the room he had been most certain did not matter. He took the $890 because it was that, or a courtroom that would ruin his other schemes, and he signed the release she set in front of him, and he was gone down the road in his hired buggy before the noon light had fully cleared the pines. Elias Thorne stood in the doorway watching the dust settle, and then turned and looked at Marisol Vega for a long, long time, and something in his weathered face had come loose and rearranged itself into an expression she had not seen there before. He did not say anything then. That was his way. But over the days that followed, as the last instruments went out, and the first new orders came in, and the debt shrank to nothing, and then to a surplus, Elias Thorne carried around inside him a thing he was slowly turning over. He had married once for the easy sweetness of it, and it had been good, and then it had ended in grief. What he felt now was not that. It was heavier and quieter and more certain, and it frightened him a little for exactly those reasons. He had fallen, without noticing the moment of it, into loving the woman who ate at his table and steadied his son and had gone to war for his home in absolute silence and won it. He, a man who could not have fought that fight, had watched her win it, and he marveled that so quiet a person could be so unbeatable a force. He was a slow man, but he had gotten there at last. The spring came on in earnest through April, the pine flat greening, the barn full again of the sound of tools, and some evenings now of Sammy laughing, a sound Elias had not heard in years, drawn out of the boy by Marisol's dry, patient teasing. She had taught the boy his letters and his figures, and when he asked, had shown him the tuning fork, and let him strike it, and hold it to his ear, and feel the pure true note of it hum through the little bones of his hand. And she told him it had been her father's, and that a true note was a true note whether anyone was listening or not. And the boy had nodded solemnly, as though she had told him something enormous, which perhaps she had. The lodge was warm now, and it smelled of bread and wood shavings, and it was by every measure that mattered a home made and not given, built by hands out of neglect, the way an instrument is built out of a plain board. On a morning near the end of April, with the sun just up over the pines and the frost burning off the grass, Elias Thorne asked Marisol to walk out with him to the log ring where the whole thing had started, and there, standing awkward with his hat in his hands, he was not good with words, and he knew it, and he did not pretend otherwise. He said he was a slow man, that she knew that better than anyone. He said he could not offer her romance, that he was too plain and too old and too worn for that. But he said the works were sound now, and the boy loved her, and the fire, he said, and here he stopped and started again. The fire burned better with her. He said he wanted it to keep burning that way. He said he wanted her to stay, not as help, but as his wife, if she would have a slow man who had taken far too long to say so. And Marisol Vega, who had walked out of the dark 7 months before with nothing but a bag and a tuning fork, and had made, out of that nothing, a home and a family and a life, looked at him standing there twisting his hat. "Elias Thorne," she said, "I've been hoping you'd get around to it since. About the first week you took your time. He said he supposed he had." She said that was all right, that a slow man was fine, so long as he was a steady one, and that he was the steadiest thing she had known in her whole hard life. Then she stepped in against him, and he put his arms around her, the way a man closes his hands around something he means never to drop, and the boy, watching from the doorway, made a small, pleased sound and ran to press himself against both their legs, and the three of them stood there, in the log ring, in the new spring sun. They married in May in the barn, among the aging wood, with the crew and the nearest neighbors as witnesses, no more than a dozen souls in all. Marisol wore a dress she had sewn herself of pale gray linen, and carried a fistful of wild lupin the boy had picked, and there was no grand vow spoken that had not already been made 100 times over, in 100 small acts, in bread baked and books balanced, and a war fought in silence for a home. The truest promise, she thought, standing there, had been made months back at a cold fire, when a tired man had said a fire burns better with company, and had, without knowing it, meant every word of the rest of his life. They ate at long tables in the barn until dark, and the crew brought out the first instruments finished after the debt was cleared, and someone played, and the pine flat rang with music for the first time in years. 5 years on, the works had grown to twice their size, a second barn raised, 3 hands hired, orders coming faster than the wood could age. There were 2 more children now besides Sammy, a girl of 4, with Marisol's dark eyes, and a boy of 2, who could already, his father swore, hear a false note. On a golden evening in that 5th summer, Marisol Vega Thorne sat on the porch with the ledger closed on her lap, watching her children run through grass gone amber in the low light. And Sammy, 12 now and tall and talking freely as any boy, carried the little ones on his back and made them shriek with laughing. Elias came up from the barn smelling of rosewood, and sat beside her the way he had sat beside her 10,000 evenings now, and said nothing, which was how they said most things. On the mantel inside stood her father's tuning fork, polished bright, and beside it a framed release, signed by a broker named Witt, kept not out of spite, but as a reminder of the day, a quiet woman. She thought sometimes about the woman who had walked out of the dark that first cold night, with nothing left of who she had been, and she marveled at the distance between that woman and this one, and she knew the distance had not been crossed by luck, or by passion, or by any grand and sudden thing. It had been crossed slowly, plank by plank, evening by evening, by 2 people who had each seen in the other the exact worth that the rest of the world had overlooked, and who had chosen, without hurry and without doubt, to build a life on it. Love, she had come to understand, was not the flame that leapt up bright and burned itself to ash in a night. Love was the tending of the fire, the quiet, patient adding of one true thing to another, all through the long, cold seasons, until at last, and for good, it burned steady,